Hi, welcome to a new series, A Little Women's Holiday, based on the beloved novel written by Louisa May Alcott. If you're new here, my name is Laura Ingalls Gunn, and every year I select a new theme to decorate my home during the holiday season. And some of the past years have included Irving Berlin's White Christmas, Tasha Tudor, and many more. And I'll link to some of those down below in the description box. Now, I have loved Little Women since I was a girl. And fun fact, my daughter is named after the character Beth, who has always and still remains my favorite. And this year I wanted to get back to a cozy, homey feel for our home. Like many of us, it's been a little bit of a struggle, and I thought the warmth and love that the March sisters share with each other, as well as the kindness that they show their neighbors, was something to really reflect and hold dear. And I hope that you'll join me each week for the next few weeks as we create decor, recipes, crafts, and even historical fashion. Today's video is going to be Thanksgiving themed. I am going to be sharing a recipe for Beth's squash. If you remember, Beth and her sisters wrote a paper called the Pickwick Papers, and one of the articles was the story of a squash. I'll read that to you in the next segment. I'll also be sharing some small gifts that I've made to spread Thanksgiving joy to my neighbors that might inspire you to do something similar. And lastly, I am going to be making a basket liner. Beth famously carried a basket with her when she made rare outings out of her cozy home. And over the summer, I watched almost all of the different movies and miniseries that have been made over the years. And one of my favorite Beths was played in 1949 by the wonderful Margaret O'Brien. And so the basket that I was looking for was in the style after that movie. And I just wanted to make a cheery little liner for it. So I envisioned Beth putting in needles and perhaps knitting needles, yarn, embroidery, and I didn't want it to fall through the open weave that the basket has. And it is a great beginner project, and I hope you'll be enjoying it. So for now, let's get started with the story about Beth's squash. In chapter 10, titled The PC and the PO, the sisters are writing one of their editions of the Pickwick portfolio. And Beth shares the history of a squash. Once upon a time, a farmer planted a little seed in his garden, and after a while it sprouted and became a vine and bore many squashes. One day in October, when they were ripe, he picked one and took it to the market. A grocer man bought and put it in his shop. That same morning, a little girl in a brown hat and a blue dress with a round face and a snub nose went and bought it for her mother. She lugged it home, cut it up, and boiled it in the big pot, mashed some of it with salt and butter for dinner. And to the rest, she added a pint of milk, 2 eggs, 4 spoons of sugar, nutmeg, and some crackers, put it in a deep dish, and baked it until it was brown and nice. And the next day, it was eaten by a family named March. Now, in Little Women, they talk about food quite often, and it's richly descriptive and always makes me hungry. But for the most part, this is the only item of food where it really talks about specific ingredients. And the second portion of the squash is basically a custard with the addition of the eggs and milk. And I really wanted to try this. Now, there are various cookbooks titled the Little Women Cookbook, among others, but I wanted to create my own type of custard recipe using the same ingredients that Beth has talked about. So we'll go into the kitchen and I'll share my ingredients, the various amounts that I used, and we'll put the recipe together. So let's head into the kitchen. To make Beth's squash, I will be using the following tools: a clean dish towel, a rolling pin, a whisk, a potato masher, a mixing bowl, and then a glass dish to bake the squash in its final stages. Now, in terms of ingredients, I have 1 pound of butternut squash that I have peeled, removed the seeds, and then chopped up into chunks. I have 1 egg, a teaspoon of nutmeg, and a teaspoon of cinnamon, 3 tablespoons of brown sugar, a pinch of salt, 2 tablespoons of butter, and about 15 crackers that I have crushed up. Now, you can crush up the crackers with a blender or a food processor. Since I am making a somewhat historical recipe, I went old school, and basically you just take and put your crackers in between the clean towel and then your rolling pin, and you just go over it until you get the consistency that you want for your crushed crackers. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to boil the butternut squash for about 20 minutes in water that is lightly salted. In the last segment, I forgot to mention the milk, although it was in the original ingredients list. So we're going to whisk up that 1 egg and then slowly add in the 1 cup of milk. Okay, so it gets good and mixed in. Okay, so then once we have our mashed squash, we'll add this in. And the other thing that we need to do is melt 1 of the tablespoons of butter and add it into the cracker. And you can kind of dump in some of the crackers too to get all the extra bits of good butter left in. We don't want to waste anything. You know, food was very precious in 1861, 62, when the war between the states was going on, and many women were left at home alone, having to do everything. There weren't any grocery stores there. Okay, so we're just going to mix it up really well to get it nice and sprinkled. We're going to add a little bit of the cinnamon and nutmeg to this. Maybe just a little bit more butter. That was only 1 tablespoon. I had said 2 tablespoons. I'm going to go ahead and melt that 2nd tablespoon of butter. Okay, adding the remaining tablespoon of butter gave it a really nice, well-mixed consistency. And I'm going to add in half of the brown sugar to this. The remaining half will go into the squash mixture along with the remaining nutmeg and cinnamon. I'm just going to really incorporate that really well. Break up any little big clumps. Oh, it's starting to smell so good. And then hopefully the squash will be done. I think maybe I should have made the cubes a little bit smaller. They're taking a bit longer to cook. And then I need to turn my oven on to 375 degrees so it can start to warm up. That humming that you hear is my stove, because everything's electronic. That's a fan that comes on. It's not ideal when I'm trying to cook, but anyways, and we are going to grease this pan. It's just plain butter. So I'm gonna give it a liberal coating on the bottom. That'll help the mixture not stick, give it a little bit of a richer taste. You never can go wrong with butter and sugar and eggs during the holidays. Okay, that looks pretty well covered now. All right, I am going to check on the squash now. I don't know if you can see the steam coming off of the squash, but it is nice and soft. And I have already put in the extra cinnamon and nutmeg and the remaining brown sugar. Alright, that looks pretty well matched. And I forgot a spoon, so let me grab a spoon. Alright. And then I'm going to slowly incorporate the milk and the egg. I think I'm going to add maybe 1 more egg. You know, I've made custard before, and I think it needs it to help it set up. You don't want to do all of this just to not have the custard set up. So I'm going to put these over in the sink. Pouring everything everything into this buttered dish. Make sure everything's nice and incorporated. There was a little bit of a chunk of brown sugar, so I kind of want to break that up. Although that would be a nice bite for somebody. It smells so good. I'm not a huge fan of butternut squash, but I think this will be pretty delicious. It looks kind of liquidy. I hope it sets up. And then it says just a sprinkle the cracker mixture on top, and you can hear my oven. It is now at 320. We need it to be 375. And it's gonna bake. I'll let you know of the final bake time once I put it out. This is looking good. I'm sure this will help it to thicken up as well. You know, how can you go wrong with butter and cinnamon and whole milk and eggs? All right, so as soon as my oven gets to the right temperature, we're going to be putting this in. Here at Storybook Cottage, each holiday season, I force paper whites and I put them in various containers. This is just a white narcissus bowl that I put in some pea gravel and add water, and it starts blooming. Now, one of the things that I loved about Little Women is how kind the family was to their neighbors. We all can use more kindness and joy in our lives. And if you followed me for any length of time, you know that I have some really fantastic neighbors. So I always like to acknowledge them during the holiday season. And this year I really wanted to share a little bit of our garden, our own yard. And a tornado had come through and had taken down a section of our fence. And my husband was able to reclaim the wood and make these cute little wooden boxes. And inside is some wooden straw material that had come in a package that I'm repurposing. And then I've just nestled a little paper white that I've started, and I had collected some seeds from plants I had grown earlier this year, so those will be planted in the spring in this biodegradable container. Now, so my neighbors would know how to take care of these plants, I printed out some instructions, picked up some twigs from my yard and just hot glued them onto the back of the instructions. And I had added a little bit of twine and some pine cones, but I thought it would be pretty to add a little seasonal plaid bow. And since we're early holiday season, I thought green was nice. I had gone into Joann's and they had all of their fall decor at 80% off. So like these little picks, I think they were like 25 cents. And so I just make a little bow and then slide in the pick underneath. It's a little bit of a squeeze. It takes a little bit of finessing, but it'll come through. Maybe, maybe not. Of course, because all three that I've already done wink together, no problem. There we go, there we go. That just kind of pretties them up until they can open up the package. And so Gracie and I will deliver these to our neighbors on our daily walk. Probably tomorrow. It's actually the end of the day now because filming this episode has taken most of the day, but I just love them. I think they're so cute. I sure would be happy to get these cute little gifts. The next segment that I'm going to read is from chapter 5, Being Neighborly, and this is the first time that Joe visits the Lawrence house. Lori is under the weather and Joe pays him a visit to keep him occupied. No, I came to amuse you. Shall I read aloud? And Joe looked affectionately towards some inviting books nearby. Thank you. I've read all of those, and if you don't mind, I'd rather talk, answered Lori. Not a bit. I'll talk all day if you'll only set me going. Beth says I never know when to stop. Is Beth the rosy one who stays at home a good deal and sometimes goes out with a little basket? Asked Lori with interest. Yes, that's Beth. She's my girl, and a regular good one she is too. So for one of the items that I wanted to create as decor in my home was absolutely Beth's basket. And so I thought the best way to make a basket a little bit more festive was to create a liner for it. So I'm gonna set out my sewing supplies, and this is a wonderful project that I think you'll enjoy, and it's perfect for beginners, any type of new sewist, and can actually be done by hand as well if perhaps you don't have a sewing machine. For this project, I am going to provide information on how to create a basket liner, and this basket I found at the thrift store, and basically how I put the liner together, you should be able to use those instructions to create your own liner, even if your basket has perhaps different measurements. Now, with this liner, because I was basically in essence drafting a pattern, I wanted to create a muslin mock-up first. I'm a little bit of a messy Marvin, so my liners need to be washable, and so no doubt the mock-up will get a lot of use. And it basically just consists of an oval bottom, because of course that is my basket shape, and then it has a long rectangular piece that I sewed up with a French seam and then joined via gathering to the oval, and then added some twill tape ties, and just to make it a little bit pretty, some scrap lace that I have. Now, for the ties, you can also use ribbon, or for this next basket liner that I'm going to show you step by step how to create, I used the same fabric to create ties. So we're going to set that aside, and the first thing that you're going to do is you are going to trace the bottom of your basket onto some sort of paper. I used one of my paper grocery bags. I love paper grocery bags for pattern pieces. It's a great way to recycle, and they're also very sturdy. And so basically, I just put my basket on the piece of paper, and I took my pen and went all the way around to get the shape. And then you can also see that I added a 1/2 inch seam allowance when I was cutting it out. So when I go to sew it, I know that I can join the side rectangular piece to this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So are you with me so far? And then the second measurement that you're going to take, and you'll use a measuring tape, or if you don't have a measuring tape, you can use a piece of string. You'll just put it inside the basket, and in this instance it was 7 inches to the top of the basket edge. Now, since I wanted to be able to have another 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side, I cut out my piece of fabric 8 inches wide. And then to get the basket diameter, you're just again going to take a tape measure and go around your basket to determine what the circumference is. And so in my case, this is what the piece ended up looking like. So we have a piece that is 8 inches wide and 33¼ in length. It was actually a little bit over 32½ for the circumference of the basket, but because when I joined the two ends, I wanted to create a French seam, I cut it a little bit longer. So again, take your bottom piece and create a pattern to include a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And so when you cut it out, it's going to look like that. And then you're going to measure the circumference as well as the height of the basket. And then for my ties, since the fabric that I cut this from was 54 inches wide, I had a whole section that I wanted to use up, the scraps. So for that, I cut a 2-inch wide strip from the remaining fabric. And basically for those pieces, we're going to sew one end and then down the length of it, cut it in half, and that'll create one of my pairs of ties. Now, in the essence of time, I have already created 6 ties, and then on camera we'll create the last pair of ties. And so that's a total of 8 ties that I need for this basket. So I need 2 for this side of the handle, 2 for this side, and again on the other side. So that results in 8 ties. So the first step that we're going to do is we are going to join the 2 raw edges together. And I'm just going to pin these. And you might see this beautiful sewing machine that is sitting next to me. This is my Singer 128K, and I bought it from my dear friend Heidi last spring. Heidi lives in the Houston area, and we know each other through costuming. I've been to some of the Houston area Regency and Victorian gatherings, and we became friends. And I have been searching for a hand crank machine for about 5 years now. And the reason why I wanted a hand crank machine is sometimes when I volunteer at historical parks, I like to do sewing projects. And of course, if I'm outside, I need a machine that works beautifully without electricity. And so Heidi had listed this machine for sale. She is a lover of old machines and likes to restore them. And so as soon as she posted it, I said, "It's mine, it's mine." And in full transparency, I will not be sewing on this machine. It takes a little bit of time, as you can imagine, and as I'm on a time crunch, I'll be using my modern Janome. So let's head over into the sewing room to sew up our first seam. So the first step in creating a French seam is that you're going to sew a basic stitch all down the length of your fabric. And I do back stitch on either end. Now for myself personally, I spend as much time at my ironing board as I do my sewing machine. So I am pressing this seam that I've just stitched out. I press it on either side, okay, just like that. And then I press it together at that seam. So it just gives you a nice crisp finish. And to create a French seam, which is basically an enclosed seam, then you're just going to run another stitch right along here. And so that is going to enclose the rough edge. Now, a lot of times I will trim this sewn edge down a little bit more. I am going to fit check it to the basket. Let's raise the camera up so you can see what we're doing. Okay, before I sew that seam, I kind of want to see where we're at. So just kind of place it. Okay. All right, now I still have quite a bit of space. Okay, so just double checking. So if I do another 1/2 inch seam, my basket should fit pretty well. So next thing I'm going to do is stitch up that seam that we just pressed right along so I can enclose my raw edges. So I just sewed it so you can kind of see that seam is all enclosed now. Now, Do we have to do a French seam? No. You can just do a single seam if you want. The reason that I want to do it is because when I wash this lining, which inevitably I will spill food in it or something, this way it won't unravel. So I've now pressed it flat, and again, now we're going to double check the fit. And this is where, you know, it just pays to take time. And again, because you have the 1/2 seam inch allowance on the bottom as well as the top, it's a little bit taller, but that is a perfect fit. So, you know, again, measure twice is always a good rule. So the next thing that we're going to do is add the bottom piece. So I'll show you that step next. Our next step is that we need to join the rectangular side piece to the oval bottom piece. And as you can see, there's a lot more fabric on the rectangular piece. And the reasoning is because the basket diameter is smaller on the bottom than it is at the top. So we need to make one of the sides smaller to join to the bottom piece. And how we're going to do that is we're going to run a large gathering thread right along one edge. And you can either do this by hand. I'm going to do it on the machine. And you won't back stitch because you want to be able to gather those threads. So I'm going to quickly go over to the machine and do that. Okay, it's a little bit hard to see, but I've just run a gathering thread, a very long stitch along the edge of my fabric. And it is about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. And the reason why I did that is because my seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. So by doing that, my gathering threads will be hidden. Now, to make sure that I have an even amount of space when I'm gathering the fabric, I like to take the bottom piece, the oval, and fold it in half and give it a good pressing. And then you can fold it in half again, so then it looks like this, and you press it again. Okay? So then when you do that, you see how it's 4 shapes, sort of pie shapes, but 4 quadrants. And then you do the same thing with your rectangular piece. You start with your sewn edge and smooth it out and give a good pressing. Okay, and then you again fold it in half, so then it's a square, and give it a good pressing. And then that results in a press seam. Can you see that? So that it is divided into 4ths as well. So then when you are pinning and gathering, it's easy to keep track of if you are equally spaced in your fabric. It's just a way to make it look a little bit nicer. So I'm going to take my first ironed edge and match it up to the seam of the rectangular piece, and directly across I'm going to repeat that. Okay, and then I'm not going to quite do the sides yet because we need to first start gathering the fabric. So just going to keep gathering the fabric, and then once I feel like I'm getting close, then I'll pin those edges. And then it's just a matter of stroking the gathers. That means that you just kind of play around so that the gathers are evenly spaced to the fabric that you're joining it to. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So I have everything gathered and pinned. I like to use a lot of pins to hold everything in place. And then I'm just going to take that edge and slide it underneath. Let me find my seam. I like to start and end right at the seam. It helps me to keep track. And so for this, I'm doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I have set my stitch back to a smaller stitch size. So you can kind of see it's starting to look like a basket, and I kind of just double check to make sure that everything was sewn together correctly. There aren't any puckers or extra material that got caught, because sometimes that can happen when you are gathering fabrics together. So the next step is optional. So on this raw edge, I am going to use my serger to finish that edge. If you do not have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch, or if you are sewing this by hand, you can do an overcast stitch. And that's just, again, to finish the seam so that when you wash this in the future, it's going to hold up really well. So let me go ahead and serge that really quickly. Just a quick tip, I used distilled water in my iron. Distilled water is better because it doesn't have all of the minerals that can clog up your iron. So, quick tip. Okay, so you can see I have finished that edge on the serger. And again, you know, all along you're gonna probably get tired of me fitting the basket, but I just want to see how it's looking. And it's kind of dark. Ugh. Well, it is working, okay? Trust me. Now, the next thing that I want to do is, since it does fit well, I am going to press out that interior seam. So I'm going to start. I always just start on the seam edge because it's a great marker for starting and stopping. And I'm just smoothing it flat. So where I just joined the oval bottom piece to the rectangular piece, you know, pressing to me is almost more important than sewing. This is what gives you your really professional looking garment or project. And as I said, I probably spend more time at my ironing board than I do at my sewing machine. Okay, almost there. So our next step now is to finish this raw edge. And so again, you know, based on measuring things, I know that I want a 1/2 inch. So I am going to iron this down a 1/2 inch all the way around, and then I'm going to go back in and fold it and iron it again. So then the finished seam is like 1/4 of an inch wide. So I'm going to iron all the way around. One thing that I forgot to mention is once the liner is in the basket, you will want to be folding down the edge on the outside, so then it will be smooth looking all the way around here, if that makes sense. So that's where you're gonna fold down, press, fold down, press. Now, the next thing that we're gonna do is we are going to attach the straps. We have not sewn this closed yet because we need to do that first. So I am going to take my strip and sew one end all the way down, and then we're gonna turn it inside out to get a tie that has one rough edge and one finished edge. So again, you're going to start and you're going to do a 1/2 inch seam or even 1/4, pivot, and then sew down that, and then you're going to flip it inside out. Everyone has their little sewing tools that they love. Now, some people will flip out their ties inside out with a safety pin. I have this tool that I got at, I think, Auto Motion. They're for you to stick into your yard if you have a long driveway. Anyways, a lot of people will use a wooden dowel to flip their ties inside out. I like this because it is a smooth plastic. And basically you take the end of your tube that is sewn shut and you kind of feed it over the end, and then you're just bringing down the fabric. So much faster than a safety pin. And then I just use a little seam ripper to make sure my corners are pulled out, and then I give it a good press. So let's go attach these ties. We have our fabric all smoothed out in the basket, and the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put the handles straight up and then kind of mark on the fabric the center of the handle. I'll show you in just a second. So as we spin it around, okay, this one needs to be adjusted, okay? So then that's our indicator where our 2 sets of ties are going to go. So I'll show you how I pin them in. Took our liner out of the basket. You can kind of see where the 2 indicator pins are. So I'm going to take one of my ties, and I like to put the seam side towards the pin. I'm just going to tuck it underneath that folded edge, and then I'm going to flip it over. So then when I'm stitching it, I'm basically, in essence, stitching it twice, because with ties, you know, there's a lot of wear and tear. So again, let me go over this again. So on this side, the seam is going to go towards this pin, and I'm just going to tuck it under that seam and then flip it over the seam and pin it in place. And then we're going to stitch it. So I've already done the other side. So let me show you that up close. Okay. So you see, you're going to have two sets of ties because they go on either side of the handle. And then once we get this other set of ties pinned on, so I have two more ties to pin on, then we'll reinforce this second set, and then I'm going to add a bit of lace to hide my stitching. This last step is completely optional. If you want, you can just sew this seam closed and your liner's finished. I wanted to add a little bit of lace to the edge. Sorry, I'm trying to figure this out, how best to show you. So what I've done is I've taken some lace and I started pinning it, and it goes all the way around right on the edge. And at the end, I've left this little bit of tail. So once I get close to the end, I'm going to fold it under to then sew it closed so it'll have a nice finish. And then by adding the lace and doing this last line of stitching, this is also helping to reinforce, once again, your ties. I think this turned out pretty darn cute. It adds a nice pop of color. The ties are long enough to make little bows. You don't have to worry about things falling through the basket strips. I'm pretty pleased. I just took the butternut squash out of the oven. It made the whole house smell absolutely fantastic. The dish is a little less firm and a little less sweeter than a pumpkin pie. It's definitely more of a custard, and I think I'll pair it this evening with some chicken and green beans. I'm sure it's going to be delicious. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of learning how to make a basket liner and fun gifts for your neighbors. If you did, I would appreciate a thumbs up, which is located down below, and in the corner is the subscribe button if you would like to be notified of upcoming Little Women themed episodes in this series. I think we still have 4 more to go. Next week, I will be welcoming my friend Tiffany of Stitch and Addiction. Tiffany has made several Jo March inspired dresses over the past couple of years, and she'll be sharing those designs, as well as our collaboration to create a dress for Marmee that I will be wearing in subsequent videos in this series. So I hope you'll definitely come back for that. And each day over on Instagram, beginning November 24th and running through December 24th, we are going to be having daily themes for a Little Women holiday. And I hope you'll join in on the fun. Each day we'll have a prompt designed to inspire you. And we want to see your recipes, your crafts, your historical fashion, maybe history bounding, decorations, anything goes. Kids, pets, everyone can participate. It is open to one and all. So thank you so much for joining me today. Thanksgiving, and that's just a narcissus bulb that I put it's got water in it, and Gracie is thirsty. I'll just eat this. It's really good.